Good morning, everybody. We're just going to take a few minutes, just a minute actually, to let anyone else who needs to come in to be able to enter. So if you can just be patient for a minute, we'll make sure that we have as many participants as possible before we start. Okay, so we're going to begin and want to first begin, of course, by welcoming everybody to this webinar on modular construction. So this is there will be a couple of presentations on modular construction, modular housing as a suitable option for seniors housing. We want to begin, of course, with a land acknowledgement. So if I could just invite you to sit back in your seats and take a nice, good, deep breath. I would like to begin by just acknowledging that the United Way acknowledges the homelands of the Indigenous people of this place we now call Canada, and honors the many territorial keepers of the lands on which we work. I personally would like to acknowledge that I am coming from the traditional territories of the Snuneymuxw people on Vancouver Island. And I am very grateful as an uninvited settler to be living and working on the Snuneymuxw First Nation land. I invite anyone who is participating in the webinar, if you'd like to put in the chat the lands on which you're coming from, that would be very welcome as well. So in terms of the webinar, just so you are aware, everyone will remain muted and cameras will be off for the duration of the webinar until we get to the question period. So there will be a 10-minute question period at the end. You are welcome to use the Q&A feature to ask any questions that you have. And I will pose those questions to the presenters. You can also throw a question in the chat box and we'll try to get to those questions as well. This webinar is being recorded and will be posted on the Healthy Aging Core website, probably within the next day or two. So the goals of this webinar are to provide a modular housing kind of 101 overview, to be able to share with you examples of how modular housing is working in community currently, and to share recommended next steps on how to integrate the learnings of this webinar into housing strategies for the community-based seniors sector. Also encouraging you to use the contents of this webinar to inform your own work, move that forward, and perhaps help you also advocate when you're talking to elected officials in your area, etc. So I'm going to begin by introducing the first presenter. The first presenter is James Broadhead. James is coming to us as the business development lead for Nomodic. So with over a decade of experience as a sales and business development leader in the construction industry, James Broadhead has worked with clients all over the world. James is passionate about conveying the benefits of modular and prefabricated construction in helping clients and communities fulfill their visions. Since joining Nomodic in 2019, he has helped guide the completion of multiple housing projects in British Columbia and throughout Western Canada. Before joining Nomodic, James served as a business manager for Britco, which is the Black Diamond Group. Thank you, James, and over to you.
Thank you, Deborah. Now I've got to figure out how I can share my screen. Just give me a second. Okay. There we go. So yeah, thank you for that very warm welcome, Deborah. I really appreciate it. Modular is something that I'm very passionate about, so I'll try and keep that into the 30 minutes that I've been allotted. And then any questions we can obviously talk about at the end. So from a one-on-one perspective, what I'm hoping to do today is to talk about the what, why, where, when of modular. There's a number of different competing terms within the industry, so we'll talk about some of those. We'll look a bit about the history, and I ran out of W's, but we'll also talk about the benefits and the challenges, and then also want to spend a bit of time talking about why modular is important to senior living, or more importantly, how senior living can use modular as one of the tools within their toolbox. So Nomodic, founded in 2012, I guess in the short version is we're a general contractor that specializes in modular delivery. So for us, when we're delivering buildings, there's a number of different types of modular, which we'll talk about a little bit later. But in terms of where we work, about 90% of the business that we currently deliver is actually in British Columbia. And in some of the different funding streams that we have experience in, that's the rapid housing to homelessness, which was one of the original BC Housing modular programs. It's been obviously replaced now more so by the Community Housing Fund. We've also done some of the CMHC Rapid Housing Initiative, which has been delivered over the last couple of years. And then we've also worked on women in transitional housing, and then also Indigenous Housing Direct with a number of different First Nation communities, primarily on the coast of northern BC. So what is offsite construction? What is modular? What's prefabrication? What are the modern methods of construction? These are the terms that are interchangeably used within the industry. And so one which is coming up more so now is modern methods of construction, MMC. It's a term which is coming out of the UK, but it's a broad term which is used to describe more so the innovations in construction, including technology, and offsite manufacturing just happens to be one of those. And it's all about the efficiency of building processes. A lot of this actually is driven from trying to make sure that construction is more productive than it's been over the last 20 years. There's been a lot of studies which have been done to indicate that the productivity within the construction market has stagnated. But why is that important? It's important because productivity equals efficiency, which can equal cost. And so by having a more efficient building process, the thought is that you can essentially get more productivity out of the same market. Offsite construction or prefabrication or prefab, essentially is the same thing. Really what we're talking about here is the manufacturing of components, whether that's elements or modules that are essentially built off-site, and then they're brought together and assembled in their final on-site location. Design for manufacturing and assembly. This is one as you start to get into the modular world a little bit more. This is a bit more of a kind of up and coming trend to talk about. And this is really around optimizing the design for production. And I'll talk to this a little bit later in terms of why this is important. And then lastly, volumetric or modular, which is a term which is broadly used in the market to describe many different things, is essentially, it's an offsite form which builds in three-dimensional, and that's the volumetric piece that comes with modular. So when we look at that in kind of like a real world example, if you will, you've got volumetric up in the top left corner, and that's those 3D boxes that get built in the factory. But you've also got panelized, which is something that people don't talk about an awful lot, but it's a great building technology. It's been around for a very long time, and it really helps to get the envelope closed up a lot faster. And so you would use volumetric in a different place that you use panelized, but it really comes down to what the goals are of the project. You can also see that in component form. And so actually a lot of buildings are built with some form of offsite construction, whether they've assembled some of the electrical distribution panels offsite, whether they've assembled a component, like for example, a bathroom pod, and then brought that to site and assembled it on the full tower all the way up. These are just examples that people don't necessarily are aware of, but it can be possible. And C-cans, love them or hate them, really good for delivering products on boats. There has been a bit of a trend or some appetite, should I say, to look at C-cans as an effective way to deliver fast modular buildings. Different people have different opinions on them. I think shipping containers are really good for shipping. I think there are other opportunities or alternatives to get your project goals met with different methods that aren't necessarily repurposing. And I think we're probably in a bit of a shortage anyway of C-cans and shipping containers today. So the cost efficiency probably isn't quite there. It can take both temporary and permanent forms. And so when you see like workforce housing, which I think is what most people would probably relate a modular building to, that's a temporary form. And so it's built to a temporary code, temporary building materials. It's not built to last for 60 years, but a permanent structure which on the bottom right of the pictures, this one, that's one that we actually built in northern BC. It's a modular building, but essentially it was finished on site with the roof and the siding, and it looks exactly like a permanent building that was built next door. So I think there's a big distinction between temporary and permanent, and a permanent building should be no different than any on-site built product. You can take many different types of construction materials within modular. So wood, steel, mass timber, composites. So to try and break that down, what we normally see is that composites would go into things like panels, mass timber, so that would be CLT. Tallwoods in BC is a great example of that building. Incredibly environmentally friendly. It's a beautiful looking building. It's got, it looks absolutely wonderful. Steel, I'd suggest, is more akin to if you've got a concrete building or a concrete, if it was built off site, what type of material would you use? And if concrete's the answer, then steel and modular is typically the solution, because you have to be over a certain amount of stories, or you would typically be over a certain amount of stories. You don't have to be. It's more cost effective to go tall with something like steel, whereas wood and modular is what we normally see in volumetric, because we're competing typically with wood framing, and so it's a like for like cost material. The history of offsite, it's not new. So even though we talk about modern methods, it's not that modern. The new technology that's coming into the market, that is for sure. But I've got two examples here of early modular, if you will. Sears was one of the early adopters, believe it or not. And they were essentially flat packing all the components that are required to build a house into a rail car and transporting it across the country back in 1908. And that really increased in popularity. They then started doing things like mortgages, and then the stock market crashed and they had to foreclose on a lot of their customers. It wasn't particularly good luck. And so they closed that part of the business and rebranded to what we've seen, I guess, more recently. And then they closed that again. Resurgence was after troops returning as an affordable and fast way to be able to build housing. 1855, Florence Nightingale, she actually requested, interestingly by the Times, a hospital to be built. And they assembled it with 16 units in Gloucester Docks, or where it was actually built. They brought over the French soldiers, trained them in how to do the assembly, and then shipped it over to where it was going to be assembled. So I guess the point being it's new, but the adoption rate, I'd suggest, is probably a better question as to why it's not as widely used in the market today. Some of the advantages of modular, there's different studies around the world that talk about different advantages. I think once we kind of boil it down, the majority would agree that it's faster, it's a higher quality, and it's more environmentally friendly. The rest depend on location and depend on knowledge and depend on who you're using. But I'll talk a bit in a moment why it's faster, but the quality piece is you're building in a controlled environment. You're not building, you're not shipping a lot of materials up to northern Canada and then leaving them exposed to the conditions and having to overship 10% of the building materials, which you're going to lose to weather damage. And when you build in a controlled environment, you're really controlling that weather impact to the building and how it then performs. The environmental benefits is you're building with a product that you're ordering. And as I mentioned, those materials that you're using, you also can sustainably control them as well. But like I mentioned, there's ways where you're normally taking, in a conventional construction practice, you're over-speccing all the materials in terms of the quantities due to wastage, due to offcuts, due to damage. Whereas what we typically try and do in a modular fashion or in a prefabricated fashion is that we're trying to build to the optimal size. So we don't really want to cut ends off wood because really there's not that much cost saving by cutting it off because you're still paying for the material anyway. So build a building a little bit bigger if you can. So there's some of the things that we'll look at from a design versus cost perspective. But that's where you'll see a lot of those types of benefits because material is ordered to size and also the materials they're using. And then from a construction perspective, on a conventional construction site, you'd have multiple vehicles which are showing up to be able to drop off, deliver, and the more remote it is, the bigger the transportation piece. Whereas in a factory type of setting, no matter what type of technology you're building, they're using usually their local supply is making shorter deliveries to that factory. All the assembly is happening, and then it's one transportation per box. So the idea is that you have less transportation, which is then also more environmentally friendly. And then the other part of it is to do with landfill as well. And so less goes into landfill through manufactured assembly, because it's all about efficiency versus wastage. Not that conventional construction is wrong in any way, shape, or form. I think there's a place for both. Modular offsite construction is just a tool of construction. I don't think it should be deemed as anything more than that. United Nations Environmental Programme, construction buildings represent 36% of worldwide energy consumption, and it's a leading impact on CO2 emissions as well. And so anything we can do to try and reduce those numbers, modular or offsite construction can also help in those practices as well. So why is it faster? So when we build in a factory, no matter what it is, that's happening at the same time as the site's getting developed. So in a site built, you would go through the same design, the same permitting approval process, and then you would start your site development. And once the site development was complete, then you would start building upwards with your building. What basically is happening is that while the site's getting built, the building that's going on top is built in a factory at the same time, and then they're delivered and they come together on site. And so that time saving, if you were looking at, say, a 40,000 square foot building, for example, that might take 2 years through a conventional construction process, whereas we could do that in 10 to 12 months through a modular process. But it's not all roses. There are challenges. And so some of those challenges, you'll notice that cost is a benefit and it's there as a challenge. And the reason for that is that it depends. It depends on where you're building. It depends on why you're building it. It depends on the materials that you're selecting. And I think one of the biggest challenges that we face in the industry is really knowledge. And that really comes down to the wrong building type or the wrong type of offsite construction selected, where components would make better sense. In some cases, they'll use a volumetric delivery, which might be not the right solution. And so as a result, some of those cost efficiencies are not gained, but that's typically down to knowledge for the most part. And then the other reason for that is labor. So if you look at the Alberta market right now, I'd suggest that in most places it's cheaper to build on site, albeit it's slower. And so there's that I guess, conflict, if you will. Whereas if you're looking at, say, the remote communities off the coast of BC, we found cases where we're about 20 to 30% cheaper through offsite construction compared to conventional construction. And then also cost, it depends on the process you go through. So if a offsite specialist is involved in some way, shape, or form to help design that building for fabrication, then you can get a more efficient design for fabrication. When the design is inefficient, that drives cost, because more variability within the construction or the manufacturing process, that lack of productivity, same with on-site construction, that has a labor cost component to it, and that increases it. So cost is a challenge. It's also a benefit, but again, it depends on the situation that you're working within. Design flexibility. So this is a big one. What we typically find is that the community will come to us and say, we've got this building, we've already designed it, but we've come against some challenges. We want it to be faster. Can we put this through a fabrication facility? And the answer invariably is no, because it was designed for on-site. And I'll show you some drawings of what I mean by that in a moment. Lack of coordination between on and off-site scopes. So that coordination piece, any handoff, is incredibly important, because if the on-site and the off-site are misaligned in any way, then what typically will happen from an experience is that causes a big delay, which causes cost, which causes rework. And then from an experience perspective, it can turn people off because they had a bad experience. Whereas if that's coordinated very effectively, then you can really get ahead of some of those challenges before they even happen. Perception. So this is what I'm talking about, the application of temporary or CCANs, and people think that's what the modular can be used for, or in a construction sense, they've worked in a site office, and that's kind of their expectation from a quality standpoint. Whereas if you were to go to somewhere like Sweden or Hong Kong, for example, Sweden, I think, is close to 65% of their buildings are built off-site, and a large portion of their concrete is actually built in panels. And so it's kind of just a bit of a different way to be able to think about it. But I think perception is one of the biggest challenges that we face from an adoption perspective. But that also then filters down into the delivery of the buildings. Knowledge, I think I've touched on most of these, but really it comes down to designing a building for manufacturing and assembly. It's knowledge of the fabrication process of what will and won't work, and then it's the installation knowledge, and all that comes back to all these points above. And the last one's interfacing. which I guess is just a different way of saying the on and off-site scopes and where they actually meet on site and how they interface together. So I've got a video here which looks a little bit at the process, but this is more to the assembly process. So this is a project that was built in Tofino. It's a hotel which is on the coast. It's a very challenging site to be able to build in. Lots of constraints when it comes down to labour and labour shortages. So that's why offsite was selected. But I'm just going to play a quick video in terms of showing you how the building comes together once it leaves the factory. So you can see here, this is the truck bringing it down the road. You can see there that it's rigged, ready for craning. And then this is the interior shots of the actual building itself. There a bit of buffering there at the start, but I think all you missed was the transportation. So the value was in the craning, so I thought I'd keep going with it. You'd see there also there's temporary roofs in each one of those buildings so that they're watertight when they go into place, and then they're finished on site. So where do we see the best fit? I think this comes down to the project goals, and I think everyone has to be very clear in terms of what it is that their capabilities are in being able to deliver any type of project. And then in addition to that, what is it you're looking from the program? Like, do you need buildings to be built faster? Is cost more important to you? Is quality more important to you? Is the environment more important to you? And I think if you were to ask anyone individually about those items, they'd say yes to all of the above. But then when you start to get to the price and the budget, the price doesn't line up for those project goals to be delivered. So to me, it really comes down to working with professionals to really understand and to be honest about what it is that you must have versus what you would like to have, and then look at the type of construction methodology that makes sense. And modular is just a tool. Offsite makes way more sense in a lot of situations. Modular makes way more sense in others, but it really depends on the situation. So where we see the best fit is anything that really has an element of speed to it is really the biggest one for me. And so that's for different reasons. So if you look at affordable housing and then cost, depending on where we're building. So affordable housing is one that from a social perspective is very quick and needs to go fast. Healthcare typically invariably is a similar situation. It's the same for retail and commercial, and also for workforce and emergency responses. When we start looking at the resorts, they're actually financially driven because again, it comes down to speed. But the faster that they can build, the faster they can open, the faster they can start making money. So that's where it makes sense. In terms of senior housing, it typically is going to be down to speed and cost, or somewhere in between those two things, as a reason why it might make sense in some situations and why it wouldn't in others. And then from an Indigenous or First Nation perspective, it typically is the remoteness is where this makes sense. And so where we've seen a lot of interest in offsite construction is where you're talking about remote communities of the BC coast, where it's barging access or ferry access. We reduce the amount of ferry trips, so that actually impacts cost and it's faster. So that's kind of where we see the markets. So considerations for senior housing. Offsite construction conforms to the same building code as on-site construction. It's not built to a lower standard, if that makes sense. You still have to meet the building code. It's the same regulatory process, and again, that depends on what that regulatory process is. So in First Nation communities, there's a different way to get there, which I'll touch on in a second. You're still using certified professionals to deliver the design, and you've still got the same amenities in terms of building, fit, function, form. None of that changes. Where the difference is the same for any modular building or offsite construction, which is your design impacts delivery, which I'll show you a little bit what I mean by that. Earlier engagement in the design process, because everything has to be done before fabrication. So all that design that can sometimes happen through the course of construction needs to be brought forward in the process to the front end. It's a different team. It's people with experience in this type of methodology. It's no different. You wouldn't go to wood framers and ask them to build a concrete building or a steel frame building if their expertise is in wood framing. It's the same with offsite construction. Fabrication certification, this just really speeds up approvals. So fabricators are certified to deliver buildings to a certain standard, which follows a CSA standard, which can also help with situations where a regulatory process is not used, which is very few and far between. So yeah, I can talk for hours about that one, so I'll move on. Floor plan considerations. So these are just some of the things that, from a senior living perspective, just to be aware of. So this is all about design for manufacturing and assembly. The more consistent the module widths, the better. We do have to have chases that run floor to floor through the building because all those boxes are built independently, so that needs to be considered. We typically try and push these through to the corridor because it makes the most sense. And the biggest one is a lining of walls through the main lines because that makes it more efficient for site assembly. This is one of the buildings that we worked on, which conforms to most of those, but not all of those. But based on the amount of boxes that went into this building, we could still do runs of between 20 to 30 boxes of each of the individual box types. But the floor types look more like this. So one-bedroom units that we're more used to seeing in a condominium, whereby you've got nothing which is covering the main line. All the plumbing is off to one side or off to this side, but it's not crossing this main line. And it's consistent module widths that makes the difference for this to be an effective design. And then for this one, this is actually a 2-bed unit within the same place. This box is not efficient when it comes to cost, but it was really important to the owner that they had a 2-bedroom design. And so that's how we made this one work. Why we care about the design, it really comes down to transport. So it comes down to how we're going to ship. Everyone talks about helicopters because they think that it's quite cool. I've never actually done a helicopter lift. I'd love to do one, but invariably, I think that if we're talking about helicopter lifts, then I think we're probably going to be mismatched with the project goals in the first place. We typically need to look at road, barging, ferrying, shipping as the transportation types. Limits for us are going to be around the bridge sizes, the width of the road. In Saskatchewan, you can move 24-foot wide buildings. You can't do that in BC. And so these are transportation considerations that go into the design process. That we just need to be aware so that we can design that to make sure the outcome is met. Interior fit and finish. So both interior and exterior options are essentially endless. You can do whatever you want within reason. You can do drywall, no problem. In Duffin Cove, we did wood accents. Again, no problem. You can use vinyl covered gyprock if you prefer. It really comes down to whatever you want to do. But modular or offsite construction is not the limiting factor in this case. It just really comes down to design. And then again, creating considerations. We've got to make sure that we can actually lift the building. If we're going with volumetric, again, with panelized, you've got to be careful of the weight because those composite materials are typically quite very heavy. So the solution really is to ensure that the project is feasible. So that's make sure that you're mapping the project goals effectively to start with in the first place. And based upon that, the right technology will come through. And you can align the right delivery, whether it's on-site, whether it's off-site, whether it's panelized, whether it's volumetric. The options are endless, but it really starts with just understanding what project goals are in the first place and being true to that. Matching the delivery with the project goals and making sure procurement methodology lines up as well. So an example would be a design bid build process would not be the best suited to an offsite construction. CM or design build would be, because you can move things earlier in the process, like ordering of long lead items through that delivery methodology, whereas you can't in a design bid build. You said you have to go all the way to permitting, and then you lose all the benefit of the schedule that we're trying to get. Understand the limitations. So that's what I'm talking about, the floor-to-floor assemblies, making sure that you're aligning with, you can do all your amenities on the ground floor and make them as big and open as wide as you want. And to do that, we're going to build with conventional construction. with a concrete form, or we'll look at things like CLT options. Or you need to be aware of, say, the shipping limitations. So if we're working in remote locations, we start looking at things like what's the size of the barge? If we're using BC ferries, what's the width and the height of the modules sat on the truck that's going to make sense to get to the project site as cost effectively as possible. And then set your project success criteria to test against. And so really, these are all kind of saying similar things, but it's really understanding what's the most important thing to the client group and making sure that you're also very much aware in terms of what your input is required to be on the project, and being able to bring in certain people to be able to help where there are certain gaps in knowledge. Because again, time and time again, we find that one of the biggest challenges that we have is that a certain design has already been done without understanding how the manufacturing is going to happen. Offsites come in later within the process, should have come in perhaps a little bit earlier, and then misalignment between speed, cost, quality. And I think all those things need to be well fleshed out and using the right people to be able to do that. That's all I've got. I look forward to the Q&A at the end. Thank you. I'll pass you back to Deborah.
Apologies for that delay. Thank you so much, James. That was very interesting. I'd like to now introduce Sherry Crane. Sherry is a support specialist with Brightside Community Homes Foundation. For over 25 years, Sherry has had a person-centered approach to supporting vulnerable adults to live independently throughout the Lower Mainland. Sherry spent years leading independent living support services in community living. And most recently, Sherry has joined the affordable housing sector at Brightside Community Homes Foundation to assist residents with disabilities, older adults, and those who are vulnerable to homelessness with information and access to support services and opportunities for social connections in their community. So welcome, Sherry, and you can go ahead.
Thank you. I'm just setting up my slides. There we go. So thank you, Deborah, for having me, and thank you, United Way, for inviting me today. I'm coming to you from a housing provider's perspective. We are at Brightside one of Vancouver's biggest and longest standing affordable housing providers. We acknowledge that as land-based organization, we're privileged to provide affordable homes to people on the unceded and traditional territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations. Our vision is to help create more affordable housing stock and ultimately make living in Vancouver accessible to people of all income levels while building strong and resilient communities. Brightside owns and operates 26 buildings in Vancouver, providing homes to over 1,000 residents. 20 of our buildings are self-subsidized, and 6 have operating agreements with BC Housing. We have a mix of buildings ranging from 3-story wood frame walk-ups to condo townhouse complexes to multi-story towers. All of our residents must be under the housing income limits based on single or multiple occupancy and number of bedrooms. Most rents are calculated at 30% of household income. The majority of our residents live on fixed or limited incomes, and many live below the BC poverty line. The BC Seniors Advocate reported that 50% of BC seniors live on $26,000 a year or less. 30% of those live on $19,000 or less. What does that look like in terms of rent? A single person earning $55,000 a year would have a rent of approximately $1,390 a month. A single person earning poverty level income of $26,000 would pay approximately $665 a month. We also have residents with persons with disability status who would pay less due to ministry subsidies. Apologies for the blurry slide. Brightside is an independent living subsidized housing provider. At the core, that means we are a landlord. We don't provide services for our residents regardless of their needs, short or long term. Not only do we not provide them, we would need to be licensed and registered to provide things like housekeeping, meals, and medication supports. This is a regulation established and monitored by the Health Authority to ensure compliance with the Community Care and Assisted Living Act, residential care regulations. That said, we try to be the most supportive landlord we can be within those confines. For example, implementing our community development and resident support department, where we try to connect residents in need with community-based services and supports. Our main demographic is seniors, making up over 70% of our portfolio. At Brightside, we know that some of our residents are vulnerable and many live at an intersection of daily ongoing challenges like cognitive decline, food insecurity, social isolation, deteriorating physical and mental health. We survey our residents every year to better understand not only who we're housing, but what their challenges and needs are. That in turn informs a lot of our community-based work. While only a portion of our residents choose to complete the survey, one of the most distressing trends identified is the growing number of residents who live alone and who cannot identify anyone in their lives that they can call on for help. For those residents who identify as having no social supports, isolation, decreasing ability to engage, deteriorating physical and mental health may all go unnoticed for longer periods of time. The subpopulation data is of interest as the survey relies on self-evaluation and disclosure. Residents in these groups, for example, those who identify as LGBTQ+ or with poor mental health, might be less likely to respond due to stigma. That and the fact that many isolated people do not complete the survey to begin with means we expect the actual numbers to be higher than what has been reported. Top languages are important, especially for the senior demographic, as cognitive impairments such as dementia can make people revert back to first languages. It's no secret that there is not enough safe, affordable, and accessible housing in our cities and towns across the province. Our partners in our United Way communities of practice disclose that affordable housing is not only something seniors accessing their services need, it's something that they have little ability to assist them with. This is not an issue isolated to our urban areas and younger populations. It's important to note that 23% of homeless population in Vancouver are over 55, and this is a growing demographic every year. James' presentation demonstrates that new and creative ways of providing much needed housing is necessary to make important and overdue housing opportunities for our homeless and precariously housed seniors. When building new housing for seniors or retrofitting existing housing stock, there are some key considerations to ensuring a person can live and age in a healthy way. While the social determinants of health is ideally considered when planning and building any multi-unit housing, it's of utmost importance when planning for seniors housing. Arguably, a person living a good quality of life would have ready access to all of the social determinants of health. When some of these determinants can be met in the same location or with each other in mind when planning, not only can it be cost effective, it can increase the likelihood that a senior can live happy, healthy life with agency and choice. Some of the key factors to consider are enabling social connections, places to sit and gather, both in the public area and in one's private space. This could be options to sit and interact in groups, or to sit in one's own in a common area where a person not comfortable joining others might be able to see the comings and goings and feel connected in a more passive way. Access to outdoor areas, preferably on-site and in proximity to community parks and natural spaces. Places to interact in a more active manner and in groups. Another key consideration is accessibility. Not only accessibility in the built form, such as ramps, wider hallways, doors with easy to use handles, but also access to in-home and community-based services. This could include housekeeping and in-home personal care to friendly visits. It could be facilitating shared and reciprocal supports between residents, using individual skills and assets to assist one another. Access to community-based services and groups, such as local community centers and neighborhood houses, faith-based organizations. Proximity to community centers and schools allows for the development of intergenerational relationships and supports. The availability of cultural and language-specific services increase when seniors can easily access their community. Within all of that, walkability and easy access to transit is an important factor where seniors' housing is situated. Last, but certainly not least, is housing that is safe and adaptable. As a person ages, walk-in showers might be easier to manage than bathtubs. Ramps with low-grade inclines and elevators are more accessible than stairs. Adequate lighting is important. Visual cued alarms and entry buzzers for those who are hard of hearing or deaf. The extent of adaptability and safety measures will be different depending on where the housing sits on the continuum between independent and supportive housing. It will be dependent in part on the permanence or temporary nature of the project. Top of mind for many of us and becoming more urgent for consideration is adapting to the changing climate. As evidenced by last year's heat crisis, considerations need to be made to suite ventilation and temperature controls, access to cooling spaces, or outdoor heavily shaded areas. The pandemic and our current climate crises have shown us that clearly communicated and well-known emergency planning and social safety nets, such as neighbors checking on neighbors, are all ways to help residents build resilience in these challenging times. These key factors are not the only things to be considered, of course, but they're all factors that can be planned for and addressed in modular housing, just as well as other traditional forms of housing developments. Here's an example of one of our building complexes where sociability and accessibility were intentionally part of the design. As you can see, the three buildings face each other and share an inner courtyard where we have a large community garden. There are large and small amenity spaces equipped with bathrooms, kitchens or kitchenettes, Wi-Fi, and audiovisual equipment. In terms of accessibility, it has large connecting paths between the buildings, a ramp from street level at the front down to the outside access to the buildings and the large amenity space. A long lowered lip on the sidewalk allows street level access for ease in accessing transportation for those with mobility needs. This kind of planning doesn't come without its challenges. There are variables that can't be controlled despite the best planning, and the variables are the people who live in the buildings. People's preference for privacy versus public space, creating versus activating spaces. Identifying those who are socially isolated can still be a challenge. Just because you build it doesn't mean that it will be used by those who might need it the most. People's needs vary, and creating space doesn't necessarily address a person's sense of belonging. Often new, affordable, and social housing developments are met with a not in my backyard attitude from those living in the proposed development area. The stigma and opposition can add extra layers of stress and resulting isolation for the residents moving into the housing complex. For example, a modular housing development in the Renfrew-Collingwood area of Vancouver was met with much community backlash and media scrutiny. Community-based senior service agencies tried to make a concerted effort to engage with the senior residents in an attempt to welcome them to the community, but none of the seniors were comfortable or trusting to engage given the community NIMBYism. Complaints of lowered property values and being portrayed as drug addicts and mentally ill and criminals and a danger to the people in community was in turn met with the residents feeling unsafe and unwanted. A well-managed development with attention paid to its maintenance, outdoor spaces, and residents are what will make a development successful in a neighborhood. When homes are affordable and appropriately accessible in layout and proximity to services, the more likely a senior can age and live in a healthy and independent life. Municipalities of all sizes have the opportunity to address seniors' homelessness by enabling the implementation of modular housing in their communities. Modular housing offers the same benefits of traditional construction, and it's the shell that is the modular part. Using modular housing with intentional design, adaptability, and purpose, along with the speed and flexibility it can offer, creates a unique and hopeful opportunity to address the homeless issue for older adults and seniors that we're seeing across the province. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Sherry, for that very, very informative presentation. I'd like to now open it up to questions. First question is going to go to James. James, has Nomodic done projects to step 5 or passive housing energy standards that you're aware of?
Yep, that's a great question. So I guess just for the wider awareness, the step code is all around energy efficiency. So BC, just based on the natural climate, it's not too difficult to get to a step code 3 standard, of which I think most municipalities are currently looking for right now. And if not, then they probably will be very, very soon. A lot of the funders actually direct to what level the energy code needs to be met. And so we are seeing a bit of a growing trend now to move up through that to the high levels. So from a modular perspective, we've done and achieved up to step code 4. With modular, with step code, there's a couple of considerations. One is to do with the equipment that's going into the building and how energy efficient it is and what load that puts on the energy consumption. The other part of that is to do with insulation and how well it retains that energy. And then the other part of that really comes down to, which is kind of linked, the air tightness. So modular by design, when you're talking about volumetric modular, it's tested in the factory by each one of the boxes to make sure it's going to meet the air tightness requirements before it's shipped to site. At that point, when it's assembled, the full building's tested, but we know that each one of the suites is going to meet the certain standard. Then we're just looking for the site seaming to make sure that air tightness is where it needs to be. And so we've met step code 5 from an air tightness perspective, but the assemblies, or should I say the insulation and equipment that was selected on that building were to a lower standard. We've got currently 2 buildings in design right now, which are for passive house, and they're both multifamily of different sizes. One's a 13-story steel modular, and the other one is, I think it's 5 stories, but both affordable housing to a passive house standard in design.
Thank you, James. Next question for Sherry. Sherry, could you talk a bit about what some situations or factors might be that would result in a senior renter being unhoused?
Yes, there's in this, I'll try to make it a brief answer because it could be a long answer, but it would probably fall under 2 categories. One being financial. So the reason some of us are, would have to move from a place is that it's going to go in renovation or being sold if it's a rental within a building, a market rent, let's say, building, or a personal owner. It could be financial in terms of, unfortunately, it happens that some seniors don't do their taxes, for example, and get cut off their guaranteed income supplement, which means they're getting significantly less money every month and can't pay their rent. The other factor would be what comes with aging. Perhaps somebody's decreased ability to look after themselves or their suite. So breaches of tenancy in terms of cleanliness, let's say, or leaving things to burn on the stove, maybe if someone's having memory issues. So that's why these kinds of support services that can be offered from community can really meet those gaps. It doesn't mean that just because somebody is having some struggles in a certain area that they need to be evicted. It just means these gaps need to be filled. And it's important for all of us to make sure we have those services available in a timely manner and in a cost-effective manner.
Thank you so much, Sherry. Next question is for James. James, are there modular structures built in BC? If so, what cities or communities has Nomodic designed, constructed, and placed these modular housing structures?
It's a good question. There's there's two ways to answer this. One is the fabrication side, and then the other one is it's the on-site and the off-site piece. So from an off-site perspective, we build in fabricators across Canada. In some cases, it's actually cheaper to build in Manitoba and transport across the country, depending on the schedule and the building massing that we're trying to achieve. For something like a steel frame modular building, they're typically built actually in Europe for the most part, just because, again, it's more cost effective, and then from a quality standpoint, they're used to building much larger buildings to that size and scale. But I'd say the majority of buildings that we've built have either come from the Okanagan or from, I'd say, Southern Alberta. So they're probably the two biggest places that we'd pull from right now. In terms of on-site construction, our kind of sticks to the bigger projects, if you will. But Smithers Terrace, Surrey, Abbotsford, Chilliwack, Victoria, Nanaimo, Duncan, North Cowichan, Saanich, Bella, they're the main ones. But there are a few others which were panelized installs that we've done in a lot of different places.
Thank you again, James. Appreciate that. And Sherry, a question for you. Can you expand on what independent housing support does, what that includes?
Sure. So at Brightside, we have my department I'm in, which is community development and resident support. And because we can't offer, as I mentioned, the direct supports to residents, but we recognize that we want them to live a good tenancy, and that means being happy and healthy. What we can do is partner and work with community-based agencies and service providers to either bring some services in, maybe to our shared spaces, education-wise, or providing opportunities for connection, and also potentially escalating things to the health authority or those that can provide services for those residents that we are identifying as being in need, to the point where it is affecting their tenancy. This is all contingent upon the resident wanting to receive the supports. It's all voluntary, of course, but we definitely have lots of tools in the toolbox to go to before we would go to a warning of eviction for a resident. So that's largely where it is, and why we need all the great service providers out there in community to help us keep people housed.
Thank you, Sherry. A couple of questions for James. James, are you aware of any modular housing that does include social supports in communities across BC?
Yeah, so the projects you've worked on that have the social supports, the wraparound services, which are typically operated by the non-for-profit societies in BC. We've built a number of those through the rapid response to homelessness through BC Housing. So BC Housing has been a great provider for funding for those projects. And the other reason why BC Housing is a great provider is also paying for the operating costs and for some of those services. So in that case, we've built one in Chilliwack. We've got one which is currently under construction in Surrey, one which is in design in Chilliwack, and the two on the island, or three on the island, are also via BC Housing, and they've got different operators in those buildings to essentially provide those services. Right? The modular, again, isn't the limiting factor. It really comes down to the speed, which is the reason why modular was selected for those particular applications.
Thank you, James. Another question for you would be around organizations that you've partnered with, particularly in our province, like BC Housing. Are there any developments in the northern or rural and remote communities, and the challenges that might take into account extreme climate conditions?
I feel like that's a full webinar topic.
There's a
there's a lot there to unpack, but let me try and let me have a go. So in terms of, there's a lot of stakeholders which get involved in these projects. And so the funder is a big part of it as a stakeholder, and they typically can direct which way and how things are brought to market. So BC Housing is obviously the first and foremost. We do a lot of work directly for BC Housing, where they go into the market, they assess the need, and that's really through the Community Housing Fund. And so actually there's two ways. There's the Community Housing Fund, which is non-for-profits bringing projects to BC Housing, and there's BC Housing actually building projects for their own and then assigning or going through an RFP to assign different operators. So that's the BC Housing side. CMHC with Rapid Housing Initiative over the last 2 years has put over $1 billion into the market across Canada, and a lot of that actually went to, or a fair portion of the first round actually went to Indigenous communities. And so we've worked with BC Housing, CMHC, a number of different First Nation communities directly. And then the other way that these projects essentially get brought to life is through development consultants, of which we've done quite a bit of work with David Nairn and Associates and M&P as well. Yeah, so I think that answered most of the questions. Did I miss anything else, Deborah?
Thank you. I think there was just one query around any specific challenges when you're working in extreme climate conditions.
Absolutely. Yeah, there's a lot of challenges. And again, it's no different than the on-site portion because the foundation needs to be built on site anyway. So really what we try and do is we try and assess what those conditions are. Now, there's one part, which is the on-site piece. The other is how you're going to get there. And so that's where we're talking about, you don't really want to be barging in the winter, especially with the amount of water that you can get on the northern coast there. So really we try and pick the weather windows that are going to make sense, and we let that direct which way the project is going to go. We unfortunately got pushed into a project that was off the coast that was barging in October, and the guy spent, I think, 5 days pulling back 100-foot tarps over each of the modules to make sure that they were extra dry in addition to the extra transportation measures that we'd already made. And so that's one part of it, is really the transportation piece. And you've got to be thinking about what that window is that you're going to try and hit, but then also what you can do to try and protect the buildings and how they're going to move. And so that comes down to, do you shrink wrap, don't you shrink wrap? Does that create more moisture inside the building? Temporary roofs, permanent roofs, extra tarps for real weather, extreme weather conditions. How often you check the building, how you access the building to make sure that it's going to be watertight and it's going to be safe and secure while you're preparing for craning. But then when it comes to the actual material selections, it really comes down to, we look to the communities in terms of what the standard is, what is most appropriate, especially when working in First Nation communities. I mean, who are we to go ahead and say this we think is the best building type or material type? Because the reality is that communities got more experience of living in that community than we do, and they can tell us all the things that don't work, as equally as they can tell us the things that do work. So we really try and understand, again, working with individuals, working with each of the parties to try and get the best information. But that just comes down to material selection and then good design. So to break that down, you've got transportation we have to think about and how we're going to do that. So that's material impact. It's how it's going to be set on site, the materials that we're going to use, and that's really a lot of community engagement as much as it is using our design professionals. And then it's the design piece to make sure that the design is going to have no challenges when it comes to the constructability, to make sure it's going to go together the way it needs to. But yeah, we use hardy, we use cement paneling, we've used cedar in different places, but again, it's all got to be fit for purpose. And then the last part is, so that's more weather when it comes to rain, but then snow loading again is different. So how we design the structures to make sure it's going to take the snow load, and then what we're going to do in terms of things like roof guards to deal with snow buildup. That's the other part as well. So all of that comes into the constructability of how we build a building based on where it's going.
Thank you, James. And one last very quick question for you. Are there any limitations on modifications for accessibility in modular housing, specifically for seniors?
Not if we know about them on the front end, because if we can design for it in fabrication, we have buildings that we've put elevators into. The limiting factor is actually the supply chain of getting elevators right now. It's a bit of a short supply, but the actual, can it go into a building? Absolutely. Should it go into a building? Absolutely. But if we are trying to retrofit it later, that's a problem. But if we understand it and we can design for it early on, then it's no challenge.
Excellent. Thank you very much. Just want to thank both James and Sherry today for their time, for their incredible informative sharing that they've done. Want to also remind you that this recording of this webinar will be made available on CORE within the next day or two. Really want to encourage you, as I know that the Housing Working Group is going to also do, to carry on this work, really deepening your understanding and our understanding about modular housing, and reaching out to allies and to local government to really promote this information. We know how important it is to get housing built for older adults, and this seems to be an incredibly amazing resource that we have. So thank you again to both of you, and thank you again for everyone in attendance. I hope you all have a lovely day.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.